The laughter started 3 weeks after she moved into apartment 4B, right next to ours in the weathered brick building on Maple Street. Every time I walked past her door, that sound would erupt, sharp, brittle, like glass shattering in an empty room. My husband David thought I was being paranoid, but there was something wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the laugh of someone amused. It was the laugh of someone who knew something I didn't. And that terrified me more than I wanted to admit. Her name was Patricia Holbrook, a woman in her late 50s with silver hair always pulled into a severe bun and eyes that seemed to follow you even when she looked away. She kept to herself mostly, never attending building meetings or the occasional hallway conversations that New Yorkers pretended to hate but secretly craved. But that laugh, God, that laugh. It haunted me during dinner, during my shower, during the quiet moments before sleep. It felt personal, directed, like she was laughing at me specifically, at something only she could see. I started taking different routes through the building just to avoid her door. Then came the night that changed everything. The night that turned my suspicion into cold, hard terror that settled in my bones like winter frost. I was up late, unable to sleep, standing in our darkened living room and staring at nothing, when I noticed it, a faint flicker of light coming from the air vent near the ceiling. At first, I thought it was just a reflection, maybe from a car passing outside, but it pulsed with a rhythm that felt mechanical, deliberate. My heart began to hammer as I dragged a chair across the floor, climbed up, and peered into the darkness of the vent. That's when I saw it. A tiny lens, catching the ambient light, pointed directly into our living space. The room spun around me as I stumbled off the chair, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps that I couldn't control. Someone had been watching us, watching me get dressed, watching David and me argue, watching our most private moments. My hands shook as I checked the other vents, and I found 3 more cameras, each one carefully positioned to capture a different angle of our lives. The violation felt like something crawling under my skin, something I could never wash away. And then it hit me with the force of a physical blow. The laughter, Patricia's laugh. It happened after our most intimate moments, after fights, after tears. I didn't sleep that night, couldn't even close my eyes without seeing that lens staring back at me like a mechanical eye. David found me at dawn, still sitting on the floor surrounded by the evidence I'd carefully removed from each vent, my face pale and my hands trembling. When I told him, when I showed him, the color drained from his face in a way I'd never seen before. "We need to call the police," he said, but his voice sounded hollow, distant, like he was speaking from underwater. But I knew with a certainty that lived in my gut, that calling the police was only the beginning of understanding what Patricia Holbrook had really been doing and why she laughed every single time I walked past her door. The detective who arrived was a tired-looking woman in her 40s named Sarah Chen, with dark circles under her eyes that suggested she'd seen too much of humanity's worst. She examined each camera with latex-gloved hands, her expression growing darker with every piece of evidence we showed her. "This is sophisticated equipment," she said quietly, turning one of the tiny cameras over in her palm, like it might reveal its secrets. "Not something you buy at a regular electronics store. This is professional surveillance gear, the kind that costs thousands of dollars." The weight of her words settled over us like a shroud, and I realized we weren't dealing with a curious neighbor or a simple invasion of privacy. Detective Chen wanted to question Patricia immediately, but when she knocked on the door of 4B, there was only silence, heavy and absolute. The superintendent was called, keys jangled in locks, and when the door finally swung open, what we found made my blood run cold in my veins. The apartment was nearly empty except for a single desk, 6 monitors arranged in a semicircle, each screen divided into grids showing different angles of our apartment. Some footage was playing in real time. Some was paused on moments I barely remembered living, and some showed scenes so private I felt my face burn with shame and rage. but Patricia Holbrook was nowhere to be found, vanished like smoke, leaving only this shrine to her obsession. "She's been gone for at least 12 hours, Chen said after examining the space, her professional mask slipping just enough to show genuine concern underneath. On the desk, among the tangle of wires and hard drives, she found a leather journal filled with handwritten notes, dates, times, observations about our daily routines written in meticulous detail. My name appeared hundreds of times, circled, underlined, connected to other names I didn't recognize with arrows and question marks. The detective photographed every page, but I could see one entry clearly. She doesn't remember me yet, but she will soon enough, and then she'll understand why I laugh. The words made no sense, but they made my stomach twist with dread. David stood frozen in the doorway, his face a mask of confusion and growing anger that I recognized all too well. "Do you know her?" he asked me, his voice tight with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Was it accusation or fear? I shook my head desperately, rifling through my memories for any connection to Patricia Holbrook, any moment where our paths might have crossed before she moved in next door. Nothing came, just blank spaces where recognition should have been. But the journal suggested otherwise, filled with references to before and what she did, and making her see the truth. Whatever connected us, I couldn't remember it, and that terrified me more than the cameras ever could. Detective Chen closed the journal carefully, sealing it in an evidence bag with movements that seemed weighted with significance. "Mrs. Morrison," she said, using my married name in that formal way police officers have. "I need you to think very carefully. Have you ever been involved in any incident, any accident, anything that might have affected someone else's life?" The question hung in the air like accusation and possibility combined, and I wanted to say no, to dismiss it entirely. But there was something scratching at the edges of my memory, something dark and buried that I'd spent years trying to forget. And suddenly Patricia's laughter didn't sound random at all. It sounded like recognition, like revenge, like the promise of secrets about to surface. And in that moment, standing in that room full of screens showing my life on repeat, I felt the past reaching out with cold fingers to drag me back to a night 15 years ago that I'd convinced myself never happened. The name came to me at 3 a.m, jolting me awake like an electric shock. Rebecca Holbrook, a girl from my college days, from a night I'd buried so deep I almost convinced myself it was just a nightmare. Patricia Holbrook. The last name wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. And suddenly the pieces began falling into a pattern I desperately wished I couldn't see. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. And beside me, David slept on, unaware that our lives were about to crack open. Rebecca had been 19, bright-eyed, trusting, and I had been 21, drunk on youth and terrible choices I'd made at a party that spiraled into tragedy. I'd never told David about that night, never told anyone after the lawyers made it all disappear with money and non-disclosure agreements. By dawn, I'd pulled out old yearbooks from a box in our storage unit, hands shaking as I flipped through pages of smiling faces frozen in time. There she was, Rebecca Holbrook, sophomore year, her face round and hopeful, standing in a group photo with the drama club. And there, barely visible in the parent section of a fundraiser photo, was Patricia Holbrook, younger then, but unmistakable, her arm around Rebecca's shoulders. Mother and daughter, connected by blood, and now by something far darker. The accident, because that's what I'd called it in my mind for 15 years, had happened at a fraternity party. Alcohol and bad decisions and a moment of cruelty I participated in even if I didn't start it. Rebecca had ended up in the hospital. The details after that were fuzzy, protected by legal settlements and my own willful amnesia. I called Detective Chen before I could lose my nerve, my voice barely steady as I asked to meet her alone, without David present. She agreed immediately, that cop instinct sensing blood in the water, and 2 hours later we sat in a corner booth at a diner far from my neighborhood. The words came out in broken pieces at first, then in a flood I couldn't stop. The party. The hazing ritual that went too far. Rebecca's frightened face. The fall down the stairs that might have been an accident, or might have been pushed. I honestly couldn't remember anymore. She was in a coma for 3 weeks, I whispered, the coffee in front of me going cold. When she woke up, she had brain damage, couldn't finish school, couldn't live independently anymore. Detective Chen's expression remained carefully neutral, but I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, piecing together motive and opportunity, and the kind of grudge that festers for over a decade. The settlement included a gag order, I continued, shame burning my throat like acid. My parents paid, Rebecca's family signed, and I transferred schools, changed my life, pretended it never happened. I looked up at Chen, seeing judgment there, or maybe just recognition of how people run from their pasts. I didn't know Rebecca died 4 years ago, I said, though I'd spent the last hour researching online, finding the obituary that listed Patricia as her devoted mother and sole caretaker. I didn't know Patricia blamed me specifically, or that she'd been planning this, waiting for the right moment to make me understand what it feels like to have your privacy, your safety, your whole life stolen. The detective leaned back, processing everything I'd confessed, and I could see her weighing whether I was a victim or just getting what I deserved. She's not just watching you for revenge, Chen said finally, her voice low and serious in a way that made my skin prickle. We found financial records in her apartment. She's been selling the footage, posting clips on certain websites, trying to destroy your reputation piece by piece. My stomach dropped as I understood the full scope of Patricia's plan. Not just to watch, but to expose, to humiliate, to dismantle my life the way Rebecca's had been dismantled. The laughter made perfect sense now. It was triumph, anticipation, the sound of someone watching their carefully laid plans unfold. And somewhere out there, Patricia Holbrook was still watching, still laughing. And the worst part was knowing that maybe, just maybe, I deserved every second of what was coming. The videos had been online for 6 weeks, Detective Chen discovered, scattered across forums and websites I'd never heard of, but that David's employer apparently monitored for security risks. He came home early that day, his face gray and drawn, his briefcase hanging forgotten in his hand as he stood in our doorway like a stranger. My boss showed me, he said, his voice hollow. And I knew before he said anything else that he'd seen things meant to be private, intimate moments now public spectacle. The foundation of our marriage, built on trust, and the person I'd pretended to be, cracked right down the middle. He asked the questions I'd been dreading. Who was I really? What else had I lied about? How could I have kept something so significant hidden for our entire relationship? I had no good answers, just excuses that sounded thin even to my own ears. Patricia had been methodical in her destruction, posting content that was perfectly calibrated to cause maximum damage without quite crossing into illegality. Nothing explicitly illegal. Just deeply embarrassing, private arguments and vulnerable moments that made me look unstable, cruel, nothing like the person I'd worked so hard to become. My phone began buzzing with messages from people I barely knew, former colleagues and distant relatives all wanting to know if I was okay, if the videos were real, their concern thinly veiling their curiosity. I watched my carefully constructed life collapse in real time. Each notification another brick removed from the wall I'd built between my past and present. David moved into the guest room that night without a word, and the silence between us felt louder than any argument. Detective Chen's team finally located Patricia 3 days later in a motel 40 miles outside the city, surrounded by more equipment, more monitors, still watching even from a distance. The arrest was anticlimactic in a way that real life often is. No dramatic confrontation, just a tired woman in her late 50s being led away in handcuffs, her face expressionless. But she looked at me through the police car window as they drove her past our building, and she smiled. Not laughed this time, but smiled, and I understood that she'd already won. Even if she went to prison, even if the videos came down, the damage was permanent, irreversible. She'd wanted me to understand loss, violation, the destruction of the life you thought was yours, and she'd succeeded completely. The preliminary hearing revealed more than I wanted to know about Patricia's descent into obsession after Rebecca's death. How she'd spent 4 years planning, researching, finding me after I'd changed my name when I married David. A psychologist testified about complicated grief and pathological fixation, painting Patricia as someone broken by tragedy rather than simply cruel. I sat in the courtroom, listening to Rebecca's story told again. The permanent disabilities, the seizures, the way she'd needed around-the-clock care until a final seizure took her at just 34. Patricia had devoted her entire life to caring for her daughter, watching Rebecca struggle with tasks that used to be simple, and every day was a reminder of that night, that party, that fall. And I was the face she'd attached to all of it, fair or not, the scapegoat for a tragedy that had no simple villain. But then Patricia's lawyer presented something unexpected, something that made my blood turn to ice. Medical records showing that Rebecca's fall hadn't been the primary cause of her brain damage. There'd been something else, evidence of a pre-existing condition that the original doctors had missed, aneurysm risks that would have manifested eventually regardless of the accident. Patricia's entire crusade, 15 years of hatred and planning and revenge, had been built on a misunderstanding, a misassignment of blame. I watched her face as she heard this news for the first time in open court, watched her expression crumble as she realized she'd destroyed an innocent woman's life. Or at least, a woman whose guilt was far more complicated than she'd believed. The irony was crushing. We'd both been running from ghosts that might not have been real, both been consumed by versions of the past that weren't quite true, and now we sat on opposite sides of a courtroom with nothing to show for it but ruins. The charges against Patricia were severe: stalking, unlawful surveillance, harassment, distribution of private images, but her lawyer negotiated a plea deal that acknowledged her mental state and the complex grief that had driven her actions. She would serve 5 years in a psychiatric facility followed by probation, a sentence that felt simultaneously too harsh and too lenient. I testified at her sentencing, not because I wanted to, but because the prosecutor said it would help. And I stood there looking at this woman who'd dismantled my life and felt something unexpected. Pity. Sharp and uncomfortable, for 2 mothers who'd lost daughters in different ways. Patricia looked at me while I spoke, really looked at me for the first time without the filter of her hatred, and I saw her seeing me as human, complicated, flawed, but not the monster she'd needed me to be. David filed for divorce 6 weeks after Patricia's sentencing, the papers delivered by a process server who apologized for the timing, like that mattered. He'd tried. I could see that he'd really tried to reconcile the woman he'd married with the person I'd actually been. But the gap was too wide, the deception too fundamental. "It's not just what you did in college," he said during one of our last real conversations, his voice tired, but not angry anymore. "It's that you built our entire marriage on a foundation of lies, and I don't know what else isn't real." I couldn't argue because he was right. I'd been so busy running from my past that I'd never actually dealt with it, never actually become someone who could sustain real intimacy. The divorce was quick, amicable in that cold legal way, and within 3 months I was living alone in a different apartment across town, starting over at 38 years old. The videos eventually came down through a combination of legal action and platform policy changes, but the damage to my reputation lingered like smoke, impossible to completely clear. I lost my job at the marketing firm, not officially because of the scandal, but in one of those mutual agreement separations that everyone understands the real reason for. Money became tight, my savings depleting faster than I'd planned, and I took a job at a coffee shop just to pay rent, serving lattes to people who sometimes recognized me from the internet and looked away quickly. The humiliation of it all, the public exposure, the divorce, the professional collapse, felt like punishment, and maybe it was. Maybe Patricia had been right that I needed to understand what it felt like to have your life destroyed, even if her methods were criminal. But something unexpected happened in the wreckage of my old life. I began to remember Rebecca more clearly, not as a plot point in my personal tragedy, but as a real person who'd existed beyond that one night. I found old photos online, read testimonials from her friends, learned about who she'd been before the accident and who she'd remained, in limited ways afterward. She'd loved painting and had continued making art even after the brain damage, simple, beautiful pieces that her mother had carefully documented. Patricia had posted some of them on a memorial website, and I spent hours looking at Rebecca's work, seeing the humanity I'd erased in my own mind, the personhood I'd reduced to guilt and legal settlements. For the first time in 15 years, I let myself feel the full weight of what had happened, not hiding behind lawyers and NDAs and convenient amnesia. On the anniversary of Rebecca's death, I did something I hadn't planned. I drove to the cemetery where she was buried and stood in front of her grave for an hour. Just stood there with flowers I knew she'd never see and apologies that couldn't change anything. Patricia was in the facility by then. Couldn't have known I was there. But somehow it felt like I was finally being honest. Finally acknowledging the truth I'd spent half my life running from. I didn't know if I'd been directly responsible for her fall or if it had been an accident. Didn't know if my participation in that cruel hazing ritual made me a villain or just a stupid kid who'd made terrible choices. What I knew was that Rebecca Holbrook had been a person, not a lawsuit. And her mother's grief, however it manifested, was real and valid, and something I'd never truly considered. And standing there in the cold autumn air, I finally understood that healing couldn't come from hiding. That maybe Patricia's twisted revenge had given me something unintentional, the chance to stop running, and finally, painfully, face who I'd been and who I needed to become. Patricia and I began an unlikely correspondence 6 months into her sentence, letters passed through lawyers and therapists who thought communication might be part of both our healing processes. Her first letter was short, bitter, an explanation of 15 years of rage that she'd needed to voice even knowing it might never be forgiven. I wrote back not with excuses but with honesty I should have offered decades ago. What I remembered, what I didn't, the coward I'd been then, and the person I was trying to become now. The exchange was painful, full of accusations and defenses, and eventually, slowly, something resembling understanding if not quite forgiveness. We'd both been trapped by that night, both been shaped by it in ways that had distorted our lives, and in strange way we were the only two people who could fully understand what it had cost. The legal aftermath continued for months, civil suits from David over assets, ongoing criminal cases related to the websites that had hosted the footage, insurance battles over damages and losses. I worked with a trauma therapist who specialized in public humiliation and violation of privacy, learning to separate the shame that belonged to my choices from the shame that had been unfairly imposed through criminal action. It was messy, complicated work, understanding that I could be both a victim and someone whose past actions had hurt others, that those truths could coexist without canceling each other out. Some days I made progress. Other days I couldn't leave my apartment, paralyzed by the thought that someone somewhere might still have those videos, might still be watching. A year after Patricia's arrest, I did something that surprised even me. I started volunteering at a center for people with traumatic brain injuries, working with patients and families navigating the aftermath of accidents and illness. The work was hard, heartbreaking sometimes, but it connected me to the reality of what Rebecca and Patricia had lived through in a way abstract guilt never could. I read to patients who couldn't read anymore, helped with art therapy sessions, sat with families in waiting rooms during bad news. One of the counselors asked me once why I'd chosen this particular volunteer work, and I gave some vague answer about wanting to help. But the truth was more complicated. I was trying to honor Rebecca in the only way I knew how, trying to transform guilt into something useful, something that might, in some small way, balance the scales. Patricia was released after serving 3 years, her psychiatric evaluation showing significant progress in managing her grief and understanding the distinction between justice and revenge. I didn't attend her release, didn't think my presence would help either of us, but she sent a final letter a week later. In it, she acknowledged that what she'd done was wrong, criminal, destructive to both of us in ways she hadn't anticipated when she'd started down that path. But she also said something I hadn't expected, that the medical evidence about Rebecca's pre-existing condition, while exonerating me of direct responsibility, didn't erase the cruelty of that night, the culture that had enabled it, the way I'd run from it rather than face it. She was right, and I told her so in my response. We would never be friends, would never fully forgive what we'd done to each other. But we'd reached a kind of truth that felt more valuable than absolution. Now, 2 years after those cameras were discovered in the vents, I live a quieter life in a small apartment where I check the vents regularly and keep my curtains drawn, and still sometimes wake up at night feeling watched. I work at the Brain Injury Center full-time now, having found purpose in the wreckage of my old ambitions. David remarried, I heard, and I was genuinely happy for him, hoping he'd found someone more honest than I'd been capable of being. Patricia lives 3 states away, working with a victims advocacy group, channeling her rage into something constructive, and we exchange brief emails on Rebecca's birthday each year. A ritual of remembrance for a girl whose life affected us both in ways we're still understanding. The laughter still echoes in my memory sometimes, that sharp, brittle sound that once filled me with fear. But now I hear it differently, not as mockery but as pain, Patricia's and Rebecca's and my own, all tangled together in the complicated mess of guilt and grief, and the impossibly difficult work of learning to live with the people we've been, and the damage we've done. And maybe that's not redemption exactly, but it's honest. And after all the lies and surveillance and exposure, honesty feels like the only thing worth holding on to in the wreckage of 2 lives that collided in tragedy and emerged, scarred but standing, on the other side.